Yeah, the do not use. Yeah.
Good evening. Yeah, I'm using the microphone because otherwise people at home cannot hear us. Welcome. My name is Nina Dieters. I'm a program maker at Studium Generale. And I'm very happy that we could continue this lecture tonight because, well, due to the restrictions, it was pretty unsure. And actually, this lecture was planned for April. And I think the theme of the lecture very much applies to how I've felt during the last 6-7 months. Feels like a few weeks, sometimes it feels like almost 3 years. So yeah, I'm very happy that Hedderik was still able to do the lecture. We're here for a private lecture. But that's okay. That's fine. I'm very happy to see you here, and you as well. For the people at home, I hope that a lot of people who would attend this lecture are watching at home. You can join us by using menti.com. I hope you can see the PowerPoint slide and use the code. If not, then use the code, go to menti.com and use the code 9927644. I'll repeat that because I know that sometimes people can't see the slides. That was 9927644. So, our speaker of tonight is Hedderik van Rijn. He's a professor who works on the cutting edge of cognitive neurosciences and artificial intelligence. He is researching the concept of time, the role of time in everyday behavior, in illness and aging, and also the neuronal processes that are the basis of our sense of time. And next to that, you're also working at the Slim Stamp. You are also involved in the Slim Stampen method, a learning method that adjusts to the knowledge and skill of individual students. So a very different topic, I think, but maybe you'll talk about that as well. So for now, for people here, enjoy, and for people at home, please join in at menti.com, and then the floor is yours.
Thank you. So good evening. My name is Hedderik van Rijn, and indeed I'm a professor of cognitive science and cognitive neurosciences. I'm interested in how the human brain works. And obviously the human brain does a lot of things. And I've sort of like specialized on two topics in particular. The one thing that I want to be talking about is adaptive learning. How we can increase the learning of students by using their response times. Now, I'm not going to talk about that, but the important thing there is that I'm using the response times. And the talk today will be also about time, but then in a different setting. Because at some point in time, I became intrigued about time. I became intrigued about how we humans are able to function in time. And what I'll try to do today is to give you in a lecture of about an hour, slightly less than an hour probably, a bit of a background on how we scientists think about a particular domain of timing. Now, as already was introduced in the beginning, I hope that there are many people watching the live stream. And what I really do like is that, that if you have any question, just sort of like type it in, or if you're present here, let me know. I much rather spend a lot of time answering your questions, also during my presentation, than that at the end you say, well, it was very nice, but at that point I just sort of like lost track of the presentation. So please feel free to interrupt me. If you go to the website and use the code, I will also always, sort of like on the right side of the slides, there also always is the code there. So even if you can't write it down right now, but you have a question later, feel free to interrupt me. There's someone here following the Menti scheme, and as soon as there is a question, I'll hear it and I'll try to answer the question. Now, as said, this talk was planned for April. And that means that probably about a year ago now, I was asked, do you want to give a lecture about timing? And of course, I like to talk about my research, as many academics do. And I really like to talk about timing. And then I try to think about a theme that I want to talk about. And one of the things that many people sort of like observe is that time doesn't always seem to go as fast as it goes on other moments. When you're doing something that really sort of like, that gets you into the flow, time sort of like flies by in a second. Without you realizing there has been 2 hours passed since you started reading that captivating book. But when you're waiting for a train, or when you're, as students, sitting in a boring college, or when sort of like something is happening that doesn't sort of like get your interest, time can run very, very slowly. And it's very nice that it was already alluded to, because so newspapers have reached out to me over the last weeks and said, but what is happening now? Why are we all so confused? Why don't we know anymore how much time has passed? It's a very interesting question. But that question is less associated with how our brain keeps time than you might think. Because that question has a lot to do with how often we attend to time, but also how we think back about our past. If I ask now students or colleagues or friends, how long was actually the previous lockdown? People find it extremely difficult to judge. Was it like 3 weeks or was it like 4 months? Probably it was quite long. And the only way that I can reconstruct that is by trying to think about, okay, my son, my 7-year-old son was at home, we had to do all these arithmetic problems, and we definitely went through 2 of those books. So that must mean that it at least was like 6 weeks. But the problem is, I can't really reconstruct that. And I can't reconstruct that apart from using these sort of like explicit reasonings, because nothing happened. Every day was exactly the same. I woke up a bit earlier because then I started working, my wife took care of our son, then in the afternoon we switched roles, and then I went out to play, and then I went to do a bit of more work. And that sort of like went like this for many people for weeks and weeks. And therefore, the days, on the one hand, sort of like went by very quickly, you could say, but also in hindsight, you can't really assess how timing worked anymore. Now, I won't really talk that much about that, because what I will talk about is sort of like a lower sense of time. The sense of time that now alerted you that I was silent for slightly longer than I should have been. And that's actually interesting, because how did you know that I was silent for a long time? There was no input because I was intentionally sort of like standing still. And I'm again standing still. And maybe if you're at home, you see sort of like a second watch ticking or sort of like the video ticking, but otherwise there's no input getting into your system that tells you that time is passing, and yet we can do this. How can we do that? Well, that's the question that I'll be talking about. And I'll first sort of like also state some more things that I won't be talking about. So, just 2 days ago, I saw this news clip. Scientists clocked the fastest interval of time in zeptoseconds. Now, I'm interested in timing, so I was interested in this, and I started reading up about what it actually was. And what a group of German scientists did is that they measured how long it takes for a proton to fly through or pass through an hydrogen molecule. And that is like incredibly small, an incredibly short amount of time. It's so many seconds, so few seconds. It's 20 zeros and then a 1. Now, this is sort of like absolute timing, you could say. It's the timing that our clocks do, the clocks that we see here that you will have at home. And that kind of timing is boring for a psychologist, because we know how long it takes. If they would repeat that experiment, they would get the same results. It's an incredible feat of engineering, but I would like to know how human timing works. Let me give you another example of how human timing works. This is a commercial that was shown on French TV a couple of years ago. And I'll start it, and you can just watch the commercial. They played a very subtle trick. You see a couple in a car, a man, a woman takes out a cookie, looks at the cookie, looks at the dog, throws the cookie. There was no way that your cognitive system knew that you had to start timing. Yet, you see the dog, and you start to realize, the cookie should have arrived by now. And the fact that the cookie didn't arrive automatically in your mind gives you the idea that the car must be huge, because the cookie is traveling for this enormously long time through the air. Now, It's a funny commercial, but it's even more intriguing how our brain does that. How can our brain do these things? How can our brain, without you knowing that you had to time, know that you had to time that? How do you know to pay attention to actually the cookie being thrown? How do you know that it's not about how long the woman is holding up the cookie? We just happen to be able to do those things. And I'm intrigued with how that works. Now, timing truly is everywhere. In all forms of our behavior, timing plays a role. And that ranges from the millisecond timing that we do to catch a ball, but also that we do to move. All my actions are moving, expressed in time. We need to do that. But if you talk about timing, many people also immediately come up with the other extreme, circadian rhythms. The fact that you get tired at night, that you get hungry at certain points of the day, all those kinds of schedules. Now, you could say these things are easy. And obviously they are not, they're very complex, but we know quite a bit of how this works. We know the brain regions involved in these two systems. We know, for example, that motor timing is very much controlled by the cerebellum. We know which brain regions actually drive our day-night circuits, our patterns. But the thing that I'm interested in is the thing that's there in the middle. And it's also there in the middle in time ranges. I'm interested in timing in the seconds to minutes ranges. If I would ask you to play this game, I'm sure that all of you would sort of like know to count like 1, 2, 3, being Dutch, 1, 2, 3, and that you shouldn't do it faster or slower. How do we know these things? And this kind of timing is everywhere. And it's sort of like, it's something that these two persons have in common. Because both of them are excellent timers. Why are these two so good presenters? Are they able to sort of like get many people sort of like interested in their ideas, even though they come from very different perspectives? That is because both of them know very, very well how long the pauses should be in their presentations. They really are sort of like good at it. But it's truly everywhere. This is another example, a beautiful example of the 100-meter sprints on the Olympics. What happened at the 100-meter sprints of Olympics? The rules for disqualification changed 2 times at least. And they became more and more strict, and there were sort of like other changes. And what you can see here are the 3 different false start rules. And then the time it takes the athletes to start running after they could have heard the starting gun go off. And what you can see on the y-axis is that it takes about 140, 150 milliseconds. That's incredibly short. Because what they need to do is sort of like they are sitting there and they need to control many muscles to actually start moving, because this is the amount of time that it takes for the fingers to not touch the ground anymore. If we take 18-year-olds and we let them do an experiment and they see a flash and then they have to press a button, so do a way, way easier task, we see that the durations are longer. So that means that these athletes were timing. They were counting on when the start signal should go. Ready, set, and they were prepared to start running in the start gun. Another beautiful example of timing. But we can talk about Trump, about Obama, about Olympic sporters, but even the tiniest kid already is a pretty good timer. The game of peekaboo, is nothing but a timing game, an expectancy build-up over time. A small kid, you sort of like hide your face and you say, 1, 2, kiekaboo. And the funny part is that the kiekaboo doesn't come immediately after the 2, but that there's a pause. There's a build-up of expectation. Now, this game can be played with relatively young children. But also if you would do this as like a proper experiment, you can see those effects already in infants of about 10 months old. Because what they did is sort of like they equipped infants with an EEG cap so that they could measure the brain potentials, and they let these kids watch videos, cartoon videos. And during the video, the kids heard tones. And these tones were sort of like separated exactly 1.5 seconds apart. So at some point, and they didn't need to do anything with the tones. But every now and then, there was a tone that was slightly earlier. And what they did was that they checked for the brain responses to these tones that were earlier. Because there's nothing different about the second and the third tone, apart from that the third tone appears before you would temporally expect it. And what they saw, and that is sort of like shown in this plot, what they saw and what we can see here, the vertical line is the moment when the tone was played. And all these different colors are different durations of this earlier than expected tone. The green line is the 1000 versus 1500 milliseconds condition. So then it's relatively close. And the purple line that you see here is 375 milliseconds. So then it's way earlier than expected. And what we can see here in the left side, so the 10-month-olds, is that we can very nicely see that there is a peak in the brain potentials whenever there's a tone that happens earlier. And the earlier it is, the bigger the response is. So this indicates that even 10-month-olds have already sort of like really captured the idea of timing. Their brain registers nothing to figure out how much time has passed. Now, this is sort of like a very simple experiment. And in my group, I'm very much interested in trying to do experiments that are more similar to real life. But the problem, of course, is that if we do these kinds of experiments, we also want to ensure that we have a lot of control, that we exactly know what people are doing. And that's a very difficult balance. Now, one of the ways to solve that is to look for huge data sets. For data sets where we can get a lot of data of people doing a task in which timing is important. And what we would like to have is then a very clear onset moment when an interval starts, and a very clear indication when people have figured out that a certain duration has passed. And a beautiful data set for that, or beautiful data sets for that, can be found in computer games. For example, StarCraft. It's a game in which you have to build all sorts of units, and by building these units and then by building sort of like soldier units, you need to capture the enemy base. Now, and it takes place in a sort of like science fiction-like setup, and there's one unit shown over there, and this unit generates new other units. But if you inject that unit, 32 seconds later, additional units will appear, so you get sort of like a bonus. But you get this bonus only if you do the injects. So that means that to be an optimal player, you need to do this certain action every 32 seconds. But while you're doing that, it's of course not the only thing, because you also need to do all sorts of like other upkeep things, and your enemy players can attack you and all that kind of stuff. So the nice thing about this is that we can track how good people are to time something while they're being subtracted by other things. Now, and that's great, you could say, because this is a computer game, but there are so many computer games. But the truly nice thing about this is that people love to play this game and then take the save games and upload them to websites for others to see how good of a player they are. So we truly have tens and tens of thousands of save games of people playing this game. And what we then did is that we analyzed the performance here. And what you can see here on the x-axis are different levels of expertise in the game. ranging from professional players who actually earn their money, and quite a bit of money, by playing this game, to advanced players. And advanced truly already is advanced. These people have probably already spent a couple of months full-time on just trying to get as good as possible on this game. Now, on the y-axis, you can see the average duration between injections to this unit. And what you can very nicely see, if we just sort of like look at the solid line, we can see that the advanced players, already with months of training, take about 40 seconds or 42 seconds to give that response. Whereas the professional players, they're not at 32 seconds, but they are clearly lower at about 37. Now, this is a beautiful data set because it does allow us to actually assess timing in the real world. And it also allows us to assess what's happening in these durations. Will people indeed be faster or slower with clicking that unit if there was a lot of other stuff going on at the same time? Sort of like similar to the human analog, or the real life analog of things during lockdown taking so long because nothing else happens? Now, these kinds of questions can be answered by using these kinds of data sets. Now, I've now shown you that infants do timing, that American presidents do timing, that, well, these are mostly young adults do timing. But timing is not just limited to the human domain, because other animals also do timing, obviously, because we all know about circadian rhythms, and maybe even longer-term rhythms in animals. And obviously, there are also sort of like movement actions, and some animals are actually excellent timers in this respect. But the interesting thing, and that is interesting because maybe this sort of like cognitive interval timing could be purely human-like. But the interesting thing is that we can also very clearly see timing behavior in animals. And for example, in these hummingbirds that you see over here. So these hummingbirds, these are hummingbirds in the southern Canadian forests. And what the researchers did is that they provided these hummingbirds with these artificial flowers. And there were blue and orange flowers. And the nice thing is that the researchers could exactly indicate when new food sources became available in these specific flowers. And what they did was that they created two different flowers, and in the blue ones, new food became available every 10 minutes, whereas in the orange ones, food became available every 20 minutes. And they just sort of like let these hummingbirds explore. So this is an experiment truly in the wild. In principle, we could do it in our gardens if we would have hummingbirds. And what they showed very elegantly by just looking at the behavior of these hummingbirds is that you can see that the time that these hummingbirds on average take to go to the blue flower is about 10 minutes, whereas to the orange flower is about 20 minutes. That means that these hummingbirds apparently can assess time. And not just time that is needed in the millisecond range, because obviously to fly you need to control your muscles, and that sort of like makes sense, but even this form of cognitive timing. And we can take it even one step lower on the hierarchy, because also, for example, honeybees do timing. How do they do timing? Well, or how do we know that they do timing? Well, if a bee has found a good source of food, it's very useful to tell the other bees where actually to go to. And bees can do that by indicating the direction in which to fly and, importantly, not the distance, but the time to fly. So bees indicate to other bees, you need to go in that direction and you need to fly for so many bee time units. And they do that by means of a very complicated dance. So that means that these bees are capable of sort of like recalling where they found a good source of food. But in addition, they were apparently cognitively capable enough to communicate that to other bees. I find this a pretty amazing feat. Now, these things are sort of like experiments in the wild. But we actually also know that animals can be pretty good timers, because this whole timing field was started in the 50s and in the 60s. And based on the traditions, or like the methods that were most popular back then, most of these experiments were done with pigeons that needed to figure out how long to wait before pressing a certain lever to get additional food or water sources. So that means kids do timing, adults do timing, American presidents do timing, honeybees do timing. But how does it actually work? How does timing work? How can we account for this? And this is sort of like the big problem. This is the challenge. Because this is a picture that's called the census. It's from the body work, so it's like it's sort of this beautiful exhibition in which parts of the body are being shown. And this is called the census. And it makes sense because you see the eyes, you see the tongue, you see skin, you see all sorts of like forms of senses. But what you don't see in here is the sense of time. Yet, we've seen that the passage of time is very salient, but we don't have dedicated sensors for it. So apparently, there's not sort of like, I don't have a time sensor. So where does it come from? Where in the brain can we find timing? Because sort of like based on all these examples, I've shown you that apparently we do time. Now, one way to try to assess that is to look at sort of like a lot of academic literature and try to assess in that academic literature that looked at neural structures, at brain structures, which experiments actually found the brain to be active in a specific way when timing was being asked of the participants. And if you do that, if you sort of like look at all this literature, this is an overview of 71 papers, and you sort of like try to assess which brain areas are associated with timing, you see the orange blob in sort of like rightmost on the slide in the cerebellum. Well, that makes sense because that's motor timing. But then you also see sort of like the reddish blob up there, and that is in the supplementary motor area. And that is an area that's a brain region that's very often associated with timing. But you also see sort of like all these other blobs in the basal ganglia, sort of like the very low-level components of the brain, and you could say sort of like the circuit board of the brain, the place where information from the one area is being sent to the other area. So this sort of like tells us which regions are involved, but it doesn't really tell us how it works. And over the last 10, 20 years maybe, we've sort of like made huge advances in trying to understand how it works, or better, to come up with hypotheses how it could work. And one of them is sort of like an hypothesis that the basal ganglia, sort of like the areas that you see in the middle here, that's sort of like all the way at the core of the brain, you could say, this circuit board, is incredibly important in it. Now, it's incredibly important, but it's also incredibly complicated. It truly is sort of like not very easy to figure out how even these theories link to how we can perceive time. So that's also why I decided not to talk about it for too much. Because what I would like to do is sort of like to explain you the general idea. Because no matter of how it's exactly implemented, which is still an open hypothesis on which I and my group am also working on, you can also take another perspective, a more functional perspective. And that is to say, well, given that we know that people can do timing, what is needed to do timing? And for that we can actually go back to the models that were already proposed in the late 50s, late 60s. And obviously our current models are different from those, but the basic ideas are still there. And the basic idea is very simple. The basic idea is that there's some sort of like pacemaker. And you can think of that as a metronome, as something that provides pulses, that provides information. And the important thing about a metronome is that it always does the same thing. You turn it on and it starts ticking. The great thing, of course, about a metronome is also that for a pretty long period of time, every tick takes exactly equally long. Now, that isn't even needed for these models. All that is needed is something that you can rely on to every time do sort of the same thing. So somewhere in the brain we need to have such a thing. We need to have a thing that we can turn on and then it starts generating states, generating information, then generating mood, generating whatever in the same way. That's the one component. Now, then the other thing is that we need to have some form of system to collect the input that is generated by this pacemaker. And in the original ideas, and in sort of like the idea that I'll explain here, this idea is that this pacemaker is truly a thing that is generating pulses, generating ticks. But these ticks do not automatically reach the accumulator because there's something like a start signal. You could think of it as something that you need to turn open. Now, let's say that we are going to do an experiment, a psychological experiment. You see two dots on the screen. First one will light up, then the other one will light up, and you will need to tell which one is shorter. That's a very prototypical experiment that we would do with our participants. Now, if a participant is sitting in front of the computer screen, the idea is that this pacemaker is active, and it's just generating pulses. But these pulses get nowhere because the switch is closed. Then as soon as one of the stimuli appears on the screen, the cognitive system sends a start signal, the switch is opened, you could say, and then the pulses will actually reach the accumulator. Until the point where the dot disappears, and at that point in time you can read out this accumulator in which this temporal information is stored, and you say, okay, whatever it is that I was counting, it was 4 units. So that is then the value that I need to recall, so I'm copying that to memory. And then if the new duration comes, I open up the switch again. I again am going to wait until the stimulus disappears. And if that happens now, I can sort of like compare the 3 to the 4 and give a response. Now, this might seem cartoony simple, but in a way, this is how we think it works. The challenge is just that these individual components are all very complicated.
Yeah, I think this part you're talking about is very much about the system, but the question from someone at home is more on a more practical issue, I think. How would you explain ant colonies flying out everywhere at almost or exactly the same day every year? What kind of timing is that?
Oh yeah, so the question is about ant colonies that all starts to fly out at exactly the same date. And there are many types of insects that show this performance, sometimes even that there are sort of like multi-year cycluses. I'm actually not sure what the plural of that word is. I don't know exactly about ants. That's not sort of like my field of expertise. But I do know that many of these kind of temporal performances are driven by sort of like inputs from external sources. So, for example, in the case of the ants, I can very well imagine that it has to do with the length of the day. So how much sunlight is shining on the anthill every day, or on the outside temperature. And that if the system, if the cognitive system, if the biological system of the ant is attuned to that, you will automatically see that all this behavior starts to behave in synchrony. and therefore all these different anthills, all these different ends starts to come out at the same point in time. Let me also add to that for the people at home. I am happy with sort of like these questions also if they are sort of like one step further away from these presentations. So feel free to enter them in the chat and I'll happily answer them. Now, this is the idea of the temporal system, of how the clock system works. But how accurate is that system? Because I'm talking about the clock system. I'm talking about a metronome. And that suggests that our system might be extremely accurate. However, if we look at human performance, it isn't that accurate. So, for example, together with one of my students, I have asked participants a very simple task. Sit down, don't count, don't do anything else, but just every time you hear a beep, after when you think that 1 second has passed, click this button. And don't do tricks like saying 21, 22 if you're Dutch, or Mississippi, Mississippi. Just use your inner sense. And the kind of performance that you get then is shown over here. So on the x-axis is the number of trials, and on the y-axis is the reproduced duration. And this is just an experiment of 20 trials. And what you can see here is pretty interesting. And that is that you can see that people start out extremely slow and slowly get the hang of it. And we do not give them any feedback. Now, on the one hand, you could say that people are very inaccurate, because you can see that it sort of like starts at 2.5. So people are 250% off, you could say. But the important thing is that, well, apparently people don't have a good feel for what 1 second is. And even though that's associated with clocks, it's not what we're interested in, because we're interested in how accurate it is to do the same thing every time again. So what we need to do is not look at that it starts at 2.5, but we need to assess how far all these dots are from these dotted lines. And you can see that the green dots very nicely follow this dotted line. So that means that our clock isn't accurate, there's noise around it, but at the same time it's actually pretty good. And the nice thing also is that we can show with these kinds of experiments that there actually is very little difference between our 18, 20-year-old students and participants that are 60, 70, 80 years old. I see that there's another question.
How does the pacemaker, work with long or short times? So I think you talked about that. But the follow-up question is, do you think we have multiple pacemakers for seconds, milliseconds, and minutes, for example?
Oh, those are two very interesting questions that I would love to come back to in a couple of slides, because it's a perfect cue. I actually am going to talk about that. There was another question? Or did you? Oh, I'm sorry, I thought that there was another question. So I will come back to the different pacemakers in a bit. This was about our temporal system, how accurate is it? And what I sort of like said here is that it's pretty accurate, but of course there's noise. But the even more important thing, and the thing that is sort of like that we find even more interesting, is that, well, we humans are obviously no machines. And what more and more data is showing is that we can actually manipulate our sense of time quite easily. And we can manipulate our sense of time in the way that if we arouse participants, we can see that their internal clock goes faster. And arousing can be as simple as, before we ask people to produce 1 second, to let them hear something like this. Just a sequence of ticks. You hear tick, 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 and then you're being asked to reproduce a second. And what you see then is that people will reproduce shorter durations. Now, and that actually makes sense, Because if you think about human arousal situations, for example, the moments that people often describe just before a car accident or before another big impact thing that you can see that is about to happen, then people typically report that these seconds or these hundreds of milliseconds just before that moment felt like an eternity. I once also was driving on a road and we sort of like hit an icy patch and the car started spinning and half got onto the other side of the highway. It was a highway, it was in the US without sort of like a demarcation in between. And it was this big American truck speeding towards us. I can sort of like recall all those seconds as if it took minutes. But it must have been nothing because we spinned and luckily just in time we moved back into a ditch on the other side. The hypothesis is that because we see something like this happening, our arousal system goes in overdrive, makes our clock run fast, and that we perceive our outside world based on the speed of our clock. And that means that if the clock runs fast, we will also perceive a lot of things at the same time. But it also means that you can think about, for example, sexual arousal. Maybe this is one of the reasons that it's so difficult to assess how long sexual arousal took. So this shows that timing has an immediate consequence for how you experience the world. But now I'm going to go to the question that was asked just a second before. And that is that these systems have a number of problematic assumptions. And what are these problematic assumptions? Well, they assume that we have a clock in our minds. But if we have a clock that we can turn on and turn off again and read out, it means that we need an explicit start signal. You can only use a stopwatch to tell the time if you know when you need to press it. And think back about the commercial that I showed all the way in the beginning. There was no start signal. You didn't know that you had to start timing. Well, you could say, well, but at some point nothing changed, so maybe in hindsight I should have figured out that I should have started the clock, but that would be an extremely convoluted system. Now, the other problem is it can only test a single interval at the same time. You could say, well, okay, but sort of like a pretty decent stopwatch will have some sort of like lap times. So sure, you can do some temporal arithmetic. And we actually have shown that humans also do temporal arithmetic in lab tasks. But think about the enormous amount of durations that we constantly are sending. Think about driving a car. While you're driving a car, you need to sort of like look on your position on the road. That's of course the most important thing. But to be an effective driver, to be a safe driver, you also every now and then need to check your rear view mirror. And obviously, sometimes that's driven by external input. So if you hear someone honk, of course you're going to look in your rear view mirror. But at the same time, it's probably also, so we've also seen that even if you're driving on a completely empty road, people every now and then check their rear view mirror. And this every now and then is driven by timing. The same thing, for example, your speed. How often do you spec your speedometer? How often do you check your navigational device? Sure, you could have set it to give me an auditory cue whenever it's necessary, but I could easily think of many, many other temporal instances, because while I'm driving, I could well be having a conversation with the person sitting next to me. And in any communication, I need to think about how long my pauses are. Because if I cannot think of a word, I need to indicate that it's still my turn to continue speaking. And I do that by stating an So also that needs to be timed. If my 7-year-old son is sitting in the back and he's silent for a long period of time, I better check what he's up to. So all these durations are all happening at the same time. Now the stopwatch model that I described earlier, or the pacemaker model, indeed sort of like assumes that there is just a single clock. Now, the problem is that if you state, well, maybe we should have 2 pacemakers, then you quickly ask, okay, but what about maybe then we should have 3 pacemakers, or maybe we should have 6, or maybe we should have like how many do we need to have? So a lot of the research at the moment is trying to find sources that help us to tell time without needing an explicit pacemaker. And one of the assumptions, one of the basic assumptions, is that we are able to tell the time not by a direct stopwatch, but by assessing our memory system. So every time that I look around this room and I, for example, see this chair over there, if I would not have said, and I will walk over here so that also the people following it by video can see the chair. So this chair was in people's view here inside quite the whole time, but you didn't really notice it. But as soon as I pay attention to it, it gets noted, and the current theories assume that as soon as something gets noted, it generates a memory trace, and that this memory trace can be assessed how long ago it was created. And that way, we can sort of figure out, by thinking about our rearview mirror, how long ago it was that we actually checked our rearview mirror. And that way, timing or thinking about the number of durations that we have doesn't really become an issue of how many clocks we have, doesn't really become an issue of counting clocks, but it becomes an issue of, well, how many things can we actually keep in memory? And for those things, we probably can also pretty reasonably tell the time. And I'm going to ask you if this doesn't answer the question that was asked earlier, whether that person will be as friendly to sort of like ask a follow-up question. But this is also related to sort of like the point that was also highlighted in the introduction, in the description of this lecture. How can it be that we are so good at estimating short intervals? Because if I'm silent for too long, I only need to be silent for, like, say 200 or 300 milliseconds too long, or in a conversation, and you already get sort of like an uncomfortable silence. You already get the idea of, ooh, someone should start speaking. So that means that our temporal system this cognitive temporal system, is capable of producing these durations. But at the same time, I'm talking here, and I'm checking every now and then the time, because I have no idea whether 20 minutes or 30 minutes or 55 or maybe already 65 minutes have passed. Our system isn't very good at that. How does that work? Well, to explain how that works, I want to dive once more into the brain. Because in this basal ganglia system that I described earlier, there are cells that fire, and that fire in a certain pattern. And this pattern is very interesting from a timing perspective. What I'm going to show you here are the spikes of activation recorded in clusters of cells. And what you can see here is the spikes up in the top, and in the bottom you see sort of like the summed activity over all spikes over time, and time is on the x-axis. And what you can very nicely see is that this neuron is very, very active around 10 seconds. But it's not that active at any of these other durations. Now you can also already see that these lines are very noisy. And that means because as soon as you get into the brain, it gets noisy. But the main thing to see here is that you have this clear peak around 10 seconds. That's sort of like the sensitive duration, you could say, for this particular neuron. But then we also have one over here for a neuron that is most active at 40 seconds. And the thing that I would like you to take from this is that what you can see here is that there are neurons that start to fire after either 10 seconds or after 40 seconds. And this is an experiment in which an interval started, and then sort of like after about, I don't know exactly what the duration was, but let's say a minute, the interval was over. And these are the activities of the neurons recorded in that interval. So always when a duration passes the 10-second mark, the left neuron will fire. Always when it passes the 30-second mark, the right neuron will fire. And that means that we have in our brain a form of time cells.
Yeah, the follow-up question is, don't we get the same problem with how we assess the duration of time since the memory was stored?
Don't we get the same problem? So I don't know. So could you repeat the question once more for me to?
Yeah, don't we get the same problem with how we assess the duration of time since the memory was stored?
I'm not really sure what here the same problem is. But one of the challenges here, one of the challenges that we're trying to figure out, is how we can actually assess what the activation in our brain of a memory trace is. Because that is a necessary component for this system to work. And how can I figure out internally what the activation is of what I had for dinner tonight? So that is what we should do. Now, if the same problem is that I can only have 1 or 2 or 10 things, well, that isn't really the case, because I still can recall that when I arrived here, I wanted to park my bike somewhere safe, so I dialed for the porters to be able to store it in the shed here. That's still a memory trace, and I can still assess it. Now, the nice thing about that is that these memory traces will quickly decline in activation. So in the beginning, you have a very precise index of how long ago it is, but at some point, the activation is just pretty low. And then it becomes relatively difficult to tell the differences between, say, 20 seconds and 30 seconds. I hope that that is an answer to that question. Now, these cells that we see over here are sort of like time cells. And the nice thing is that we've also been able to locate them in many different experiments. And they are not very dissimilar from place cells that also have been identified. Place cells indicate where, for example, a rodent is in a maze or in a location. Place cells tell us where we are in time. Now, how does this then work? That we are so accurate at short durations and so inaccurate at long durations? Well, this slide actually already gives us sort of like a hint. And I've tried to depict it again in this slide over here. So let's say that we want to observe different objective times. And I've sort of like labeled this as milliseconds, but I could also have labeled it, because the same idea holds, in seconds. What I've plotted over there are sort of like the different detectors or the different time cells. Now, the 10-second cell had a relatively narrow peak, whereas the 40-second cell had a relatively wide peak. And if you sort of like summarize all literature, you get patterns that you see over here. For the very short durations, you get a very sharp peak, because that cell will only be active at, say, exactly, what is it here, say 350 milliseconds. But at the later durations, at 2000, you'll get this wide distribution. So you know that you're somewhere over there, but you don't know exactly where you are. Now, the problem in this graph is that all these dots are still equally distant from each other. And that means that there is a pretty big jump from the first one to the second one, where you don't have any sort of like observations. These two peaks are very different. That means that you wouldn't really know where you would be around this point in time. However, if you then simulate this kind of behavior in a computational mathematical model, and if you simulate sort of like the neural structures that are underlying this process, you can demonstrate that at the end, the pattern will sort of look like this. And what you see here is that at short durations, we both have these highly accurate peaks, but also we have many different of these time cells. And that thus means that if we need to estimate a short duration, we're pretty sure that we're at a particular time point, and we also pretty quickly can identify this time point from another one, because they are close together. Whereas if we're further on the axis, I should go in the other direction, if we're further on the axis, these distributions are pretty wide. So we just know that we're at about 18 minutes or 20 minutes or 18 seconds, because the scale is not relevant here in this case. And that means that we have a way more gradual jumping from the one to the other duration. And that is why the neurons in our brain, in and of itself, in the way that they are tuned, allow us to be very accurate at short durations, where it also matters, because it truly matters whether I take a pause for 300 milliseconds or for 400 milliseconds. And they become much more, well, don't care that much about the exact duration if you need to identify a duration of, say, 45 minutes versus 50 minutes. And that is how our brain can explain how we sometimes are so accurate and sometimes when timing is sort of lost. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much. No more questions from the people at home, or maybe if so, there's some time left to ask your questions. I had a question that I was thinking about all the time during the whole lecture. The sense of rhythm, is it related to timing? So I was thinking about research that's being done with babies that could sense rhythm, or at least, I don't know what they did, but it was about rhythm. And also in animals, there's a famous parrot, Snowball, I think. He can dance to Michael Jackson, but also to other types of rhythms. Is it related? Is it the same concept?
I was nodding yes, because it's related, but it's not the same concept, I'd say. But it's definitely the case that similar systems as involved, so when I showed this plot with all the neural areas, there's a huge overlap between rhythm perception and timing. And there's especially a huge overlap if you go into the domain of speech timing. That is really also sort of like closely linked to how rhythm perception works. One of my PhD students, Atser Damsma, who will soon defend his PhD thesis, has done a beautiful experiment on this, in which we had first-year psychology students, so not specifically trained musicians, listen to drum rhythms. And these drum rhythms were set up in such a way that every now and then either a hi-hat or a snare drum or a bass drum was missing. And even though the temporal systems, the temporal deviations were the same, the importance of the beat, so also whether it was on the beat or off the beat, really changed the way that the brain responses that we measured sort of like were affected. And that happened in the same way as what one would expect in the context of timing, so like in the baby study that I showed. And the baby study, you could say it's still rhythm, but a rhythm with one beep every 1.5 seconds doesn't really feel like a rhythm. So in that sense, it's clear that if you have timing and you have rhythm perception, they might be different in extremes, but there's definitely quite a bit of an overlap. The question is where it ends and where it starts. But no.
There's a question over there. You have to repeat the question for the people at home.
Yeah. Oh.
if you don't have any questions, I have a follow-up question. Because we have the sense of the perception of rhythm. There are also people that say, I really can't stick to a rhythm, I can't dance, I just can't do it. I was thinking about my mom. She is a notable latecomer. And I also heard about a book that was presented, I think it was on the radio, about a book about being late every time again. And she said, well, yeah, it's just some people have, it's like an hereditary disease. How would you explain being late constantly?
So I know that I'm always, so I don't think that I'm always late, but I'm always sort of like very close to the border. And I don't think that has anything to do with my sense of time, but more with my, well, I'm talking about myself, so I can put it in that sense, more about my lack of care of wanting to be on time. And I don't want to express this in a negative term, but it's more about sort of like assessing how long will it take me, and then when do I leave, and how bad do I feel myself if I come too late. So I would say that neither of, sort of like none of these systems, milliseconds timing, second-to-minute timing, and circadian rhythms, is associated with being late. People who are late, like myself, just need to leave earlier. But the other, sort of like the other point, that is something that so if you talk about musicians and you talk about timing, whenever I get participants in my lab, they always state, well, I'm not very good at timing, because, or I'm better at timing because I'm a musician. And a group in Italy has actually done that work. They've very carefully looked at people that are either do not have any musical training, people that are professional string musicians, and people that are professional percussionists. And the interesting thing is that only in the professional percussionists do you see a difference in timing. They are clearly much more accurate in timing than either the professional string musicians or the non-musicians. And the idea there is that, so it could be either that because you're good in timing, you become a percussionist and not a string musician, or it could be that by your training as a percussionist, you actually become better at identifying different durations. And the best way to phrase it is like, if you become an artist who is very much trained in perceiving colors, you get labels for different colors, different hues of red. You can describe them in sort of like the technical term for that red. And that means that it becomes way more easier to think about, okay, I need to buy that type of red when I go next time to the store, instead of needing to recall something that doesn't have an exact label. So the idea is that good musicians that have a good sense of rhythm get a sort of like better internal vocabulary to describe durations.
I like the term that this took because we are both professional percussionists.
Okay. Yeah.
So I was thinking of a question already in the middle of your lecture.
Yeah.
Thank you for it. It was great. It's related to the car crash moment.
Yeah.
Where your internal clock starts going a lot faster
Mm-hmm.
and you perceive everything in a lot more detail.
Mm-hmm.
This is literally what happens the moment you're on stage and you have to perform.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm not sure exactly why, but I know adrenaline plays a role in all sorts of hormones and stuff changing. So
Mhm.
that results in the performer perceiving everything that he plays slower than it is.
Mm-hmm.
And that has happened to me many times that I think, oh, I'm playing quite slow. That's maybe not exactly how I wanted it. Then at a calm time, perhaps 2 days later, I'll hear the recording and think, wow, that's so fast. I've never played it faster than that.
That's a very interesting observation, because that is direct. If you would have asked me before what would happen, that would have been exactly what we would have predicted, because your clock runs faster, And therefore, let's say that normally you wait 4 pulses, if that is sort of like the way to express that. These pulses will come in faster, so you will start your actions sooner. And that actually, so we could actually, because you get on the stage, you have stage fright, you sort of like in the most aroused state in that sense, and probably that is going to wear off a bit during the show. It will never go completely back to baseline, but typically at some point people report that they are sort of like more used to the moment. So that's actually very interesting, because that would mean that if we would not tell people that that is the case, and you could, for example, then maybe take conservatorium, I'm not sure what the English term is, conservatory students, for their first bigger show, where they are not that much aware yet of this phenomenon. And then I would predict that for the first, say, 5 minutes, the speed of the musical pieces that they would play are faster than for the second 5 minutes. That there is a bit of a calming down. That would be very interesting ideas to test.
So my question is, would you think of a way to counterbalance this?
Can you repeat the question for people?
I just realized that I didn't repeat. Out of enthusiasm, I forgot to repeat the question. So we are talking about playing musical pieces, and that when you enter the stage, you have stage fright, and therefore you have arousal, and therefore in the beginning you play a musical piece faster. And while you're playing, you think, well, if anything, I'm too slow. And then 2 days later, you hear back the recording, and you think, oh, actually, it was pretty fast. That was sort of like the question. I'm sorry, that was sort of like the question and the explanation in summary. And now the second question was, is there something to counter that? Well, there's one easy. So why does this happen? Well, it happens because when you're playing your music, when you're practicing, you're not in this aroused state. And you're sort of like getting a feel of how the music should sound. And that means, again, talking in this pacemaker accumulator idea, that between the different pieces, or sort of like if there's a certain pause, a certain break, that takes about 6 pulses. That is how you learn. You don't learn these pieces by stating it should be 752 milliseconds. You get a feel for it. Now, during stage fright, this feel is compressed because of anxiety, because of arousal, because of however you would put it. Now, the easiest way to solve that is to make sure that so there are 2 ways to solve it. One is to make sure that you have less stage fright, and there are many people that sort of like take calming medication or whatever to do that. But the other option would be to increase the arousal level during practice. Because if the arousal level during practice is higher, then you start to learn that it's like 12 pulses instead of 8. And I never thought about that before, but I think it could very well be one of the reasons why dress rehearsals are so important. Because you're at the stage, it's dark out there, so you know that there's no audience yet, but you're already completely in sort of like, today it's going to happen, or this is how it will be if it happens. So I think that you can prevent those things in this way. Now, in other ways, I'm not sure what the effect size would be, so whether you could notice a difference. But if you find other ways to increase your arousal before practicing, that would probably also work out that way. So even sort of like these click trains that I was describing, that will already increase your arousal to a certain stage. But also sporting also does these things. But I'm not sure if the effect size of these things are comparable with the huge effect that stage fright can have. I saw that there was another...
Yeah, there are 3 more questions actually.
Okay.
Someone who thanks you very much for the interesting talk. Do you have a hypothesis how it can be that sometimes you can look at the clock at exactly the same time for many days in a row, even when you're sure you did not check the clock before?
Ooh, the exactly. So how can you? How does it happen that one checks the clock at exactly the same point, at exactly the same time, several days in a row? Well, my first answer, but that was negated by the second part, is that this is one of those biases where we don't remember when we did something if it isn't special, but we do remember things if later we can assign meaning to it. It's something that's very well known in psychology, that people said, I heard the ambulance and I already knew something was wrong, and I came home and indeed I heard that, well, something bad happened to someone I love. That is a bias, because all the times that you heard an ambulance and nothing happened, you didn't store that. So that would be the one explanation. But the fact that the person said, well, even though you knew for sure that you never checked the clock, well, then I can only explain this, but that's like an hypothesis, by stating that it might be similar to why some people say that dogs always do the same thing at the same point at time during a day. So they already start walking towards the door, even though they know that the owner of the dog will only arrive in 10 minutes. Well, very often these things are triggered by the performance, the behavior of the others around that dog. So for example, it could be that someone always arrives at 5 o'clock, but that at 5:15 a train always drives by. So that the dog then could be triggered by the train. And in that same sense, it could be that if someone always checks the clock at 8 minutes past 2, that is based on the standard performance of something else in the environment. That would be the only way that I could explain this. I would not have a direct explanation how that could work based on the mechanisms that I talked about today, apart maybe from this circadian rhythm, because that clearly is the case that you will always get tired or other sort of like mental states at around the same point in time, but I would not say that's accurate at the minute range.
Could events such as almost crashing your car generate more thresholds to be reached and generate more sensory snapshots of information in memory in a very short time, causing shorter time perception?
I was yes, no. Because the idea is that if the clock speeds up, then we also speed up our perception of the world. That's an explanation that is very often given in the literature by many different researchers. So let's say that for every pulse, I take a snapshot of the world. And that's great, because normally it sort of like goes at a steady rhythm. But if something exciting is going to happen, if something frightening is going to happen, I need to have all the attention I can get. So if my clock then starts running faster, I start to pay more attention. And that's good, because therefore I get more input and maybe I can prevent my car from hitting another car. But that also then does mean that in hindsight, I have all these different snapshots, and I think, well, it must have taken quite a long time. So I completely agree with all those points, but the last point is turned around.
I'm not sure if this was already answered, because I missed the beginning of the talk. Well, that doesn't matter. But why does time seems to fly past when you're having a good time?
Yeah, so when does... It actually might be a good point to sort of like... We had sort of a discussion about that in the beginning and sort of a discussion about that at the end. Why does time fly by if you're having a good time? Well, we can, of course, talk about all these arousal-based ideas that we talked about earlier, because that definitely also influences it. But the other thing is actually way more simple. Time flies by when you're having a good time just because you're not checking your clock. And whether that's an external clock, like here on the wall, or whether that's our mental clock, our idea is that when you're focused on something, you just forget to check your clock. And because normally we check our clock every so many minutes, if we're so focused on a task that we forget to check our own clock, we suddenly check our clock and we see that we're way beyond the time that would normally have been the case. So it truly is that if you're focused on something else, you forget to check the time, and therefore it speeds by.
Oh, the person from the clock question, following the looking at the clock question, very interesting answers. Thank you. In my case, there are always different. In my case, there are always different surroundings, so the dog answer might not be the case. Still interesting, though. Not a question. Just
thank you for the
comment.
follow-up. Yeah.
So I think, yeah, that was the last question.
Okay.
So with that, I would like to thank you very much. And in the tradition of Studium Generale, I would like to give you this book by Robert Macfarlane. The English title is Underworld, Travel Through Deep Time. So he wrote a book about digging through time in the soil beneath our feet. Very interesting.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much for doing the lecture in these weird times, in this special situation. But I think it's very important to continue with these types of events and just keep going.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for
your presence.
coming out.
Yeah.
And for the people at home as well. And see you next time, online or in the room, hopefully.